Good morning. I'm Nina McLemore, for those of you who don't know. And this is our book signing session. We have people who are watching live cam, and then this is going to be available on YouTube afterwards. So you can forward the link to anyone that you know who wants to know more about it. Our next upcoming event is with David Rohl, who is on his book on Truman, Ascent to Power: How Truman Emerged from Roosevelt's Shadow and Remade the World. David is a lawyer, and he's also written books on George Marshall and Harry Hopkins, so he's an expert in that era. So it's a fascinating book, and how you all get the details that you get, and like who was in the room and what they said and what the room looked like. It's amazing to me. But today we have Susan Page with her new book, Rulebreaker: The Life and Times of Barbara Walters, and our moderator, Jean Cummings. I think for those of us who lived during part of that rule-breaking period, I really do think this is a book that every woman and men who are interested in business should read, because it's hard to believe what battle she had to fight in retrospect. I mean, some of us know that. Okay, Susan is the award-winning bureau chief of USA Today. She's covered 7 White House administrations and 11 presidential elections.
12. We're in my 12.
Okay, right. That's right. We are. She's won, I didn't know this, she's won every journalism award given specifically for coverage of the White House. She's served as president of the White House Correspondents Association and as president of the Gridiron Club, which is the largest, oldest journalism organization in Washington. She spoke to us about Madam Speaker Nancy Pelosi when she wrote that book, The Lessons of Power, and one of the questions would be, can you compare Nancy to Barbara? The matriarch, Barbara Bush, and the making of the American dynasty, which was really a quite interesting book. Both were New York Times bestsellers, and you can see the YouTube of the Nancy Pelosi interview on our YouTube site. Jean Cummings is a political journalist who served as deputy bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal and the Washington DC News Bureau. She was a reporter and the government deputy editor at Bloomberg, and she was assistant managing editor for Politico news organizations. She's a frequent panelist on the PBS political discussion program, and I'm sure you're quite busy these days. Everything somehow is political. About Barbara Walters, so I'm going to give a quick sketch. To put her in a timeline, I think it's really interesting to realize that she was born in 1929, that she was 40 when the 70s came in and women started going to work in large numbers. So, you know, she was already 40 years old when that happened. She was the first female host of numerous television programs, including Today, the ABC Evening News, 2020, and she was one of the creators of The View, the daytime program. She was the first broadcast journalist to command a salary, I think I have all this right, command a salary of $1 million, which was more than Walter Cronkite and anybody else was making at the time. She has interviewed more prominent and controversial people than any other single person ever, and probably ever will, given the breadth of our news at this point. She interviewed Castro, Putin, Sadat, Begin, al-Assad, and every sitting president from Nixon to Obama and their wives, to the notorious, like Monica Lewinsky. Do you know how many people watch that? Apparently, they believe that 70 million people watch that interview either in whole or part. I don't know if there's any football game. I mean, does the Super Bowl get 70 million?
It's the record. It still stands as the record for an interview on a single network. It was the biggest one at the time, and no one's ever matched it since then.
And Monica's brand of lip gloss sold out the next day. Tiny fact from the book.
I didn't remember that. And she did this against terrific resistance from her male colleagues and management. Some of the pictures she paints in here of some of the broadcast journalists whose names are very familiar will be interesting. Katie Couric described the book as smart, juicy, and deeply reported book about the woman who put up with a lot of so that those of us who came after wouldn't have to, or at least as much. Karen Gray Houston, who has been one of our speakers here and was an anchor on Fox 5, wrote me when I told her about this. I've always been a Barbara Walters fan. I was anchoring at ABC Radio Network when she was a megastar at ABC. I loved when she would call in to be debriefed about a major scoop. The men were in awe and envious. And I think that probably sums it up. So, the question is, what drove her, and how did she accomplish all of this, and what is her legacy?
So I'm going to do what a politician would do and delay answering the question that was just posed. Hi. To say thank you, Nina, for holding these book events. Nina, of course, dresses many authors. It's nice that she helps sell authors books too. And Stephanie, we have another author here who did a previous book for this. Nina, I believe I was the first person that you did this kind of event with. Is that right, with the Barbara Bush book? Do you remember that? I was the first one and have come back over and over again. And I just think it's great that you do this. So thank you. And my thanks to my friend Jean Cummings for coming on this beautiful Saturday morning to be the conversation partner and moderator. One thing that I found concluded in doing this reporting is you can pinpoint the moment that Barbara Walters began to have the drive that then marked her career and her life for every moment that followed. And that was when her mother, she was 28 years old. She had just gotten a quickie Alabama divorce from her first husband, a marriage that she then chose to forget. She often just would say she'd been married twice, not three times, forgetting her first husband. She was born in 1929. She told everyone she was born in 1931. So that's another little fact to be corrected in the book. So she's 28 years old. She's crashing with a friend from school in New York, and her mother calls her and says that her father has attempted suicide. Her mother didn't call an ambulance because he had taken an overdose of sleeping pills. She called Barbara. And Barbara came over to the hotel in New York where her parents were living with her disabled sister, and she called the ambulance, and she rode with her father in the ambulance to the hospital, and she realized almost in an instant that suddenly the care and financial support of her family was going to be up to her, because her father, who was this mercurial impresario, who had founder of the Latin Quarter and a very prominent showman of his day, was suicidal. He tried to commit suicide because his nightclub had just gone bankrupt. And her mother was perennially unhappy, and her sister had special needs and would never work or go to school or live on her own. And so at 28, Barbara Walters realized that this was her, this was on her. And at that point she looked with real intent for a job that she now needed. She had kind of dabbled in television before. She went back and with some effort got a job as a writer in television, as the girl writer in television, and she was off. And she was this fear of her obligation and meeting it for her family was something that never left her. It was never enough. She was never confident that things were set, that everything could vanish in an instant as it had for her father. And it drove her and her decisions from then on.
Now let's stick with the father for a minute. What I found really interesting in the book, because I didn't know her background, I knew her as, a TV interviewer and personality. But her father was a contemporary P.T. Barnum. I mean, that's how showmanship, when you mentioned it, his nightclubs were way over the top. And she absorbed a lot of that in terms of being a big personality, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Her father had great influence on her in that respect,
Yeah.
but personally they were not that close.
Well, he shaped her life, but she said as an adult that she could not remember ever hugging him. Can you imagine? I mean, even if your father is not emotionally available, wouldn't you think at some point in your life you would have hugged him? So that was part of her drive too. And there was a moment years later after her father had died, when in 2008. So now she's 70. How old would you be if you were born in 1929? How old are you in 2008? Anybody here can do math? Anyway, you're
70.
70. Okay, you're really old. Thank you very much. The businesswoman can do the math in her time. So she's almost 80 years old, and she's writing her memoir, which was called Audition. And she found she attended Sarah Lawrence, and she found in this Sarah Lawrence application that her father had filled out a questionnaire for the college as part of the admissions process. And it had asked a series of questions about whatever girl was applying. And he wrote how proud he was of her and how smart she was and how curious and what good friendships she formed in school. And there was all this affectionate material that he had never told her. And so it was this revelation to her, but too late for her to, have understood that and been comforted by that during her life.
So we've talked about, and you name the book, The Rulebreaker. She broke a lot of ground for a lot of women, including you and me.
Yeah.
But what was not, give some specific examples of how bad it was for her. I mean, the chauvinism was way over the top. I mean, we had some of it in the 80s and early 90s, but what she was up against, since no woman had been accepted and done it before, she was like the first woman walking on the moon.
Yeah, that's a great image.
So what are some real examples of how they tried to keep her pinned down?
So when she got that first job as a writer on television, the man who hired her said he hired her because she had a great ass. And this was not said like in secret, right? This was like the totally acceptable assessment of why he might hire her. And then she worked, one of the rules she broke was to be very ambitious, which was considered not really seemly in women. And she finally manages to get on the air on NBC's Today Show when Hugh Downs was the host. Does anybody remember Hugh Downs? Great. He was the exception to the rule. He was very supportive of her. He thought she had talent and possibility. He did what he could to promote her. But he left the Today Show and was replaced by Frank McGee, who was such a jerk. And Frank had contempt for Barbara and didn't like her even being allowed on set with him. And he called a meeting with he scheduled a meeting with the network news president and insisted that Barbara attend too so that she would get the message. And the network news president agreed to a rule that Barbara could not speak during interviews until Frank had asked the first 3 questions. Can you imagine keeping Barbara Walters silent for all that time? And I'll just one more thing, maybe one more example. So then Frank McGee dies unexpectedly, but to Barbara's great benefit. She thought that was kind of funny. That she became co-host of the Today Show over Frank McGee's dead body, but it's literally true. Viewers would send in all these condolences to her, which she thought was amusing too, given how poisonous their relationship was. she finally gets the job she really wants, which is to be co-anchor of an evening network newscast. I mean, that is a big job now, but that was the preeminent job then, a job of great respect and authority. It was the job that Walter Cronkite held at CBS. So she finally gets this job, and she's co-anchor with Harry Reasoner, who has this very avuncular manner, and people think he's a wonderful guy, and he was not. He was not a wonderful guy. He created, at first he said he would quit if they hired her. And then when they gave him a bunch more money, he decided not to quit. But he created what you would call today a hostile workplace. He would be fired today for the things he did to her in that workplace. And on the air, he would show how little he would made no effort to mask his view of her. So they do, on TV newscasts, they do what's called two shots, which is one anchor is talking and the other anchor is looking at his or her colleague. And they had to stop doing them on the ABC Evening News because they would show Barbara talking and he would be scowling at her. People would write in letters. ABC had to write a form letter for a response from the letters they were getting from hundreds of women saying, do something about Harry Reasoner, this is outrageous. So that's what Barbara put up with. And, you know, I think it's easy to forget how toxic it was for her. You know, she didn't have a model. She didn't have much of a mentor to help her out, figure things out. She was the first and for a long time the only in those positions. And she just sucked it up and plowed on. And it left scars. And I think it's easy to forget now. It's not that everything is perfect now, perfectly level playing field, but things are so much better for women now than they were for her. And I think it is easy to forget and to fail to acknowledge what it was she did.
Now, one of the things that struck me in reading this is you talk to people in their 90s
Yes.
who still could contribute, you know, good information and vignettes. I found that remarkable. How did you find them?
So
were they all in homes? I mean, where?
So here's a lesson I learned with the first book, which is do interviews by date of birth. That is, find the oldest people, interview them first, because you can't guarantee they'll be around. And so, yeah, you'd laugh, but so when I was starting out, I made a list of all the people I knew I wanted to try to reach. And then I looked up on Google their dates of birth, you know, on Wikipedia or wherever I could find it. And I tried to reach out to them in the order in which they were born. And this, I don't know, does that sound gruesome or macabre? Because I'm sorry if it does, but, and the fact is, with this book, as with the previous ones, some of the people I interviewed died before the book was done. You know, Dick Wald, who was a very important figure in Barbara's life, and Av Weston was another one, and Bill Getty, who was the co-creator of The View. All of them, I did these great interviews with them, and then months later, I would read their obits in the New York Times and think, I'm so glad I was able to talk to them in time. So that's why, you know, in terms of reaching them, sometimes you can just, you know, Google around and find people. And other times through other people, you can, you know, some people who knew Barbara well were helpful in like helping me figure out how to reach some of the people. I ended up interviewing about 150 people, which is a lot.
Yeah, but it shows in the research in the book. One other thing that you report, or two things that you have in the book that you read it here first, is you found her gravesite.
Oh, it was so hard. You know, you'd think it would be the easiest thing in the world to find somebody's where they're buried, and yet her daughter, from whom she had a long-time estranged relationship, although they later reconciled. So she dies. We all assume she dies December 30th, 2022. It's like the worst day in the world you can die if you're famous, because everyone's getting ready for New Year's Eve. The third string is anchoring the news. Nobody's watching TV anyway. Barbara would have hated dying on that day. Barbara would have preferred to die on a day where she would get the attention that she deserved, but she didn't. So then those of us who were paying attention to Barbara Walters, assumed there would be a big memorial service in New York, like at Carnegie Hall. But her daughter didn't want to do that, and ABC was reluctant to do it without her daughter's support, so there wasn't one. And then her remains, it turns out, I found, were cremated and given to her daughter, who lived in Florida. But then there was no record of what happened to them after that, so I didn't know if her remains were sitting on her mantle in her living room or had been buried somewhere. And her daughter was not helpful. Her daughter didn't throw up roadblocks to me, but her daughter declined to talk to me for this book. So Barbara's mother and father and sister were all buried at a cemetery in Miami. And Barbara had said in the past that she wanted to be buried with them, so I assumed that was the cemetery she was in. So I called the cemetery and say, I want to go look at Barbara Walters' gravesite, and they basically hang up. They won't even confirm she's there. They've, I'm sure, been told by the family to not cooperate with inquiries about it. So the direct, honest, transparent effort was clearly not going to work. So I hired a researcher in Miami who I knew, she's actually an editor at USA Today, but she's worked previously as an investigative reporter, and explained to her what we needed to do. So she first went and looked at the cemetery, but just like wandering around, big cemetery, didn't find anything. She then created a grid pattern, and she and her high school son went and tried to search it in a systematic way, and that also was unsuccessful. And so I'll tell you what she did, and I hope, again, that no one's offended by this. It was a Jewish cemetery, and the researcher I'd hired was Jewish, so she dressed as a conservative Jewish woman, and she took an elderly Orthodox Jewish woman who was a friend and neighbor with her, and they went to the cemetery office and said they were trying to find the grave of Dina Walters, Barbara's mother. And they appeared to be mourners, right? I mean, they didn't say they were mourners, but I think that was the implication of the clothing and their demeanor. And the cemetery said, oh yes, Dina Walters is buried here. And they went there, and of course, Barbara Walters' gravesite was next to her. So that's how.
And written on her head.
And so the other thing that was, so very modest, no tomb, nothing standing, just 4 stones, grave markers flat to the ground along a path. No wonder we couldn't find it. And Lou Walters is devoted husband and father, and Dina Walters is devoted wife and mother, and Jackie Walters is a beloved sister. They're all that kind of traditional language. That's not what Barbara Walters' gravestone says. It says, Barbara Jill Walters, no regrets, I had a great life. So I was glad we found that.
When one of the things that I kind of struggled with a little bit is she showman or is she a real journalist? She didn't come up the way journalists come up these days. She put on great shows. She also ignored all the rules that we in journalism have our standards that we follow, and and she just pretty much broke them all.
Yeah.
So how do you come down in that?
So do you think she was a journalist?
There's a part of me that, one of the things my answer is not really. And the reason I say that is not that she wasn't extremely hardworking, smart, and put on excellent interviews. She did all of that, and she did her homework. But she was in love with the get.
Yeah.
And as soon as she got one, she was moving on to what is the next big name I've got to land. And that's different than a real journalism path. So that's just how I see them a little differently. How about you?
So this has been a debate from the beginning with Barbara Walters, because she did definitely blur the line between entertainment and news. And she did all kinds of things that journalists at the time didn't do. She hired a PR person to promote herself. She demanded huge salaries that journalists had not demanded before. She would flirt with sources. in a way that I don't think you and I would have probably done. Maybe you're a flirt, I don't know.
No, I would have passed.
But I think, no question, she's a journalist because she was interested in what was happening in the world and curious about it and pursued it relentlessly. And the thing that she did that some people think is a negative, but I do not, is she wanted to interview not just presidents, but also Hollywood stars. She thought they were both interesting. She wanted to interview not only despots, and she interviewed a lot of despots, but also notorious murderers. She interviewed every notorious murderer who would agree to be interviewed by her. And because her assumption was, I think, a lesson from her father, what are people interested in? People are interested in notorious murderers. They might have something to tell us, something that helps explain our world. So yes, I think she was a journalist. I realized the debate. I acknowledge the debate. But to me, yes, she was. And her particular interest in world leaders with a dark side, I think did a lot to educate Americans. I mean, not everybody was interviewing Bashar al-Assad in Syria or Vladimir Putin in Moscow or Chavez or all these notorious figures that she interviewed. I think she did a lot to tell Americans about what was going on in the world. So, but it is definitely a debate that continues today. There are still people today who say, you know, she was more like her father's entertainment figure than she was like a Walter Cronkite news figure. And Walter Cronkite would be among those who never thought she was a real journalist, although she would scoop him on any number of interviews.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Let's take a show of hands. How many people, when you think of Barbara Walters, do you think she was a real journalist? Raise your hand.
Yes.
See, they're with me.
There you go. Well, let's talk about the pursuit of the scoop.
Yeah.
Because to me, just that must have been such an exhausting way to live.
Yeah.
And she was constantly in pursuit. What drove it, and how did she land so many big interviews?
Well, it was like her life's work. I mean, and she never gave up. You know, she wanted to interview Mark David Chapman, who's the guy who murdered John Lennon. And so she tried to get an interview with him when he was convicted. He turned her down. As the anniversary of the murder would come up every year, she would write him a letter in prison saying, I'd like to come interview you. He turned her down for 9 years. And on the 10th year, he said yes. So she spent 10 years pursuing Mark David Chapman to get really one of the creepiest interviews you've ever seen. But she did finally land him. The interview she was proudest of, the one with the first joint interview with the leader of Egypt and Israel in 1977 with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. You know, that was the interview that I think made it harder for people, including Walter Cronkite, to say she wasn't a journalist. She had spent years cultivating both of them. She had interviewed both of them in the past. She had maintained a relationship. She was a relentless letter writer. She would write handwritten letters to people who she was either seeking interviews with or who she had interviewed. And that meant that when that visit by Anwar Sadat to Israel finally took place, she had existing friendships with both of them that enabled her to convince them to sit down together kind of as a favor to Barbara, right? They both liked Barbara. She wanted to sit down with both of them. Okay, they'd do that. So it's not, I think people sometimes think you get big interviews by just calling people up and saying, can I interview you? But that is not usually how it works. Usually it's the result of a tremendous amount of effort beforehand.
And that one in particular, after you read it, you're going to need a nap. Because the effort that went into that was unbelievable. Tell the Gilda Radner story.
So, Gilda Radner, when she went to the ABC Evening News, her great triumph, one that where she failed. I mean, it was really a tough point in her career. Gilda Radner went on Saturday Night Live with this caricature of, we all know who, right? Baba Wawa. Yeah, you can laugh, right? It hurt Barbara's feelings. You know, she had this speech anomaly which she called a Boston accent, although that's not what it was. She had gone to voice coaches to no avail, and to be kind of parodied in this ridiculous way hurt her feelings. And her daughter told her to get over it, take a joke, and she did. And she, in the end, liked the fact that Saturday Night Live kept doing caricatures of her for 4 decades, because that is a sign of the respect of the the respect of the culture, right? To continually be on Saturday Night Live, but it still stung a little. And Gilda Radner, you may remember, died quite young of cancer, and Barbara Walters sent a sympathy note to Gene Wilder, who was her widower, and expressing condolences at the death of Gilda, and she signed it, Baba Wawa.
You may have heard this, but years ago when Saturday Night Live did Gwen Ifill, Gwen was so happy to be recognized as that famous and that much a part of the conversation.
Yeah. Well, when I moderated the vice presidential debate in 2020, I'm sure you all remember it was the fly debate. Yeah, Kamala Harris, Mike Pence, me, and a big fly that landed on Pence's head. And Saturday Night Live that Saturday showed, I mean, the big joke wasn't about me on the skit, but I was portrayed on Saturday Night Live, so I'm very proud of that.
She broke ground for us in a different way. You debate this in the book, share with us here. Ultimately, her life was one of such pursuit, and work was paramount, in part, as you write about, because of that fear of everything vanishing overnight, as happened so often with her father. Was she happy?
You know, I interviewed more than 100 people who knew her, and I asked almost every one of them that question: was she happy? And there were like 2 who said she was happy. And other people said, well, Joy Behar, is that how she says her name? Behar, okay. Joy Behar said happy-ish, which was about right. Other people would say, you know, she loved what she did. She was proud of what she did. She loved being in the middle of things. She loved having attention paid. But they didn't think she was happy. She was never content. She never felt like, I've had enough, I can just enjoy what I've done. Never, ever. She never felt it, she always felt it might vanish. If she didn't keep working, it would all go away. And you know, she never recognized any balance between work and family. If there was a conflict, her work came first. And you can see evidence of that in the fact that she had 3 marriages and 3 divorces, and a daughter with whom her relationship was so strained. You know, she paid a price for that choice that she made. That she felt, you know, she didn't have the privilege of having that choice. That if she ever chose family over work, she would fail. That she would not get the promotion, she would not get the interview, she would not be the anchor. And that's a choice she made, but it was, I think, in many ways a costly one.
Yeah, but in looking back and seeing everything she was up against, she really didn't have a choice. If she had chose family over work, then those men who were out to get her would have found a crack. Away.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I think that's true. But I do think at the end of her career, when she had become this iconic figure, even then she couldn't pivot to a different approach. And she also, some people are critical of her for this, although I think it is understandable. She was never a great friend to other women journalists, right? I mean, she cut a path that they'd followed, but she wasn't cutting a path for them. She was cutting a path for herself, and she continued to see other women journalists as rivals, not as allies. And again, she was seeking jobs for which no woman had held, and they weren't going to give 2 women the job, right? So if it was a zero-sum game in her day, in terms of getting these jobs. But she had, I mean, her rivalry with Diane Sawyer was the stuff of legend. And even when she was 80, and she was still on 2020, and Deborah Roberts had come on as a young reporter on 2020. She's still on 2020. And Deborah told me that she learned she better not tell Barbara Walters what she was working on, because if it was a good story, a good idea, Barbara would steal it. Barbara's 80, you know? Deborah Roberts is 30. What does Barbara Walters need with stealing an interview from a much more junior reporter? But it was that instinct for rivalry that she just could not give up.
Exhausting.
It is exhausting.
You also break news here in terms of the injury that,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So in 2013, you know, the British Embassy, you've probably all gone to this party because you're all rich and famous. The British Embassy has an inauguration party the night before presidential inaugurations, which is I've never gone, apparently, an excellent event. And Barbara was there in 2013 before the second inauguration of Barack Obama. And she takes a tumble down the marble stairs. And Susan Mercandetti, who was with her, said she thought she had died because she went, you know, and it was bleeding. She had injury to her head. She insisted she was knocked out briefly. She insisted everything was fine. Susan made her take an ambulance to the hospital. And ABC Barbara's publicist made kind of light of this injury, but it was, in fact, I discovered quite a serious one, a serious traumatic brain injury that contributed to encephalitis. You know, they call that water on the brain. I think that is not uncommon among older people who have falls. It contributed to mobility issues. It contributed to some cognitive decline, and it was really a turning point for her in her own health, and a very serious matter.
And ultimately, that's when she had to move from the spotlight.
Well, she moved from the biggest spot, from the most wonderful event you could imagine, which was her final thing on The View, her final regular appearance on The View, and they had all these women come out who had been women of TV broadcasters, like the women from all the networks, 24 women, the biggest names in television, to pay tribute to her. And they kept this a secret from her. So you can see her, I mean, she knew it was her last show, and she thought they were going to bring out all the previous hosts of The View. But they are instead, first out comes Oprah Winfrey. And you can see that Barbara's astonished that Oprah's there and very pleased. And then just this string of women. And she they had been rivals of Barbara too in many cases, but paying tribute to her for what her career had meant to their own. And that was a great event, and it was at the point Barbara had really been convinced that it was time for her to step away. And backstage, she was talking to one of the women afterwards, and this woman said, what do you want now? Like, do you want to travel? Do you want to, you know, what is it that you want to do? And she said, I want more time. I want more time on the air.
So we're collecting questions on the 3x5 cards. If you all
I
have,
have two first.
very good.
I'm known in my family for asking a lot of questions. I'm going to ask both of them, and then we'll collect your cards, and then we'll do it. Her preparation reminded me of Janet Yellen, because Janet Yellen is known for being over-prepared before she goes into any meeting. Barbara spent hours and days and doing a lot of. I've said that she would have been a great trial lawyer, you know, because she spent tremendous amount of time trying to understand the situation and the person. And so that's part of that question is, I think that's something that we all need to know. And then the other question is, or about that, is how she asked the questions of these people. She asked hard questions. But she was able to ask them in a way not to get a defensive response, I think. And I think that's a real art. But my other question is going to be about her image.
Okay, well, so first on preparation, you're exactly right. More preparation than anybody else did. I mean, I talked to Ted Koppel, who was a good friend of Barbara's and also a very notable, remarkable interviewer. And he disagreed totally with her style. He thought it made you lack spontaneity, and he would never prepare questions beforehand. He told me, but Barbara did. I mean, she would convene these brainstorming sessions and say, "What do people want to know from this person? How can I ask that question to get an answer? Maybe an answer they haven't given before. What order should I ask these questions in?" And over and over and over again. And she would they would write perspective questions on 3x5 cards, and she would shuffle them and revise them and stack them and stuff. And right before the interview, they would retype the final questions on 5x7 cards. But these 3x5 cards would be all worn by the end of it because they had been worked so often. And let me give two examples. One with Monica Lewinsky. She wanted to ask about sex, but she didn't want to do it in a way that would seem too, salacious or might put off a mainstream audience. And you have to read in the book how she phrased that question, because there's no question she doesn't say the word sex, but there's no question what she's talking about, and she does get an answer from Monica on it. That one is one good example. And the second one is she got an interview with Vladimir Putin, the first Western interview after the 9/11 attacks. So she goes to Moscow, and she's got her cards, but she doesn't make a card for what she wants to ask as the last question. And she didn't make a card because she was worried that the Russian intelligence services might somehow get access to her cards, and she didn't want Putin to know what she was going to ask. And she was going to ask the question last because she was worried he would stand up and walk out after she asked it. So she wanted to have done the rest of the interview first. So you get to the end of this interview, and she says, "President Putin, I have one more question. Have you ever ordered someone killed?" And he is completely impassive and says, "Yet," which, by the way, you should not believe.
So my other question is, it's fascinating reading how many people were attracted to, how many men were attracted to her. And, how I'm very interested in image. So what was it about her image that she used, or knowingly or not knowing, that actually also, in addition to all those other things, helped her?
Yeah. Well, eventually she was Barbara Walters, and that helped her, right? Because she was the leading interviewer in American journalism. So if you're a newsmaker, you understood that a Barbara Walters interview was something. That's why she could steal interviews from Deborah Roberts, right? Because she was Barbara Walters. But she was good company. She was funny, and she was flirtatious with men, and she used, I think, every skill you can think of to engage people. And I actually think the thing that she did that made her so successful was her ability to get people to engage with her in an interview and tell her things that maybe they wouldn't have told someone else, and to cry. Almost everybody would end up crying in her interviews. It became a big joke. People would come and say, "You're not going to make me cry," and she'd say, "Okay," and then by the end of the interview they'd be weeping. So
Okay, questions. The 3x5 cards.
yes, yeah.
Give them to Jean.
Thank you.
You can look at several if you want to choose which one you want to do.
We have time. Okay, so my mom, someone's mom in the room, okay, produced Not for Women Only, and
yeah.
Barbara was supportive of a fully female staff.
Yeah. Oh, that's nice. Well, that was a early show she did when she was at the Today Show, to show that she could do it without having a male co-host. Not for, who was that? Whose mother did that? Yeah.
There was, I was going to raise my hand and mention it, but I didn't actually turn it into a question on the other side.
Oh.
But I'll just share, since I have the floor, that they covered covered very contemporary issues.
Yeah.
And I remember as a 14-year-old being in the bath and my mom coming in saying, should we talk about birth control? And I just wanted to, I think I sunk right down into the bathtub. But they really tried to not just do cooking and, travel. What I recall of the show as a teenager was they really tried to cover issues that were, serious social issues.
And it was not exactly a precursor of The View, but it was kind of. The innovation of The View was women of different generations talking together. But the idea of having a women's talk show that didn't do just cooking and fashion, that was definitely something that was reflected in Not for Women Only too. And I believe that the show was originally called For Women Only, and Barbara made it Not For Women Only.
Smart. Tell us a little bit more about her relationship with her daughter.
So her daughter, guess who helped arrange the adoption of her daughter? You'll never guess, I'll tell you. Roy Cohn. I know, right? She and Roy Cohn were great friends. They met when she was 25. She was friends with Roy Cohn longer than she was friends with any of her husbands. And he was a famous fixer. He helped fix some legal trouble that her father had. And after she had 3 miscarriages and wanted to adopt a child, Roy Cohn was helpful in arranging a private adoption of a newborn, who was Jackie. I think that Barbara loved the idea of being a mother, but she was not so crazy about the reality of being a mother. The reality of being a mother is that sometimes it's great and sometimes it's not, and sometimes there's a conflict between your child and yourself, and you can't always make the decision what's good for you. Sometimes you're making a decision that's good for your child. And so they had a rough time. She struggled in school. She had struggled with substance abuse as a teenager. She ran away from home when she was a teenager, when she was still in high school. Was gone for several days without Barbara knowing where she was. So she had a tough time, and they did reconcile, and it's not that they didn't love each other. They were not a good fit. Her daughter didn't like New York, didn't like fashion, didn't like news. Her daughter liked being outdoors and camping and hiking, and it was just a difficult relationship all the way around.
And to cut Barbara some slack, she
Yes.
didn't have the greatest role model
No.
for being a mother.
No.
Because, well,
It's hard number one, it's hard to be a mother, right? Even if you're trying hard to be a good mother. And there wasn't any model. Nobody had balanced, nobody had these, no woman had had these jobs before. So of course no woman had these jobs before and balanced having a family.
and her own mother was preoccupied with caring for her sister.
Yeah, her disabled sister, that's right. So she had no model even in her
own
growing
house.
up.
Yeah. So you say she unintentionally set a path for other women.
Yes.
Can you be more specific?
So she did all these things that demonstrated women could hold these jobs and do big interviews and make huge salaries, and that made it easier, not always easy, easier for every other woman behind her, because some woman had already demonstrated it could be done. This was not her intention. She was not doing this for larger feminist reasons to clear a path for women generally. She was doing this to clear a path for herself. But it had the effect of helping all of those who followed her. And sometimes she was proud of that, and sometimes she resented that they had an easier path than she did. And that, I think, is not, for women who were groundbreaking in law and medicine and science and academia and the military, I think this is something that is not uncommon among whoever it was that was making that first difficult push. Do you agree?
No.
You disagree?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a couple of generations ago, women would create it and wouldn't mentor. But I think there are huge mentoring
Yeah.
organizations and opportunities now. And I think, at least in our generation, that grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we feel an obligation to. I've never met any woman that I've asked to mentor somebody or even mentor me that said, not even close.
So I completely agree with you. I think this was the reality in her day. I don't think it's the reality today, or at least it's not the universal reality today. And now there is less of that sense of zero-sum game. If you succeed, it's going to cost me. And now I think women in journalism are much more supportive of each other than they were even when I started in the field.
Yeah.
So that's one of the big changes I think we've seen in the workplace.
Yeah,
Not
because she grew up in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s.
Yeah.
Way, way back. But that leads us to another question that fits nicely with this discussion. Did she have women on her team?
Mm-hmm.
And how did she treat them? And did she mentor any of them in any way?
So she had both women and men on her team, as producers and directors. And many of the women I interviewed who worked for her were very grateful to her for the experience and that she was really smart and capable. But she didn't have only women. She had a mix of genders there. And my sense is that she would be helpful and mentor women who were not going to be on the air. Mm-hmm. Women who did not want to be her, but wanted to be directors or producers, that she was more likely to help foster their careers.
I have one last question from a viewer, and that is, did she have mentors? Mm-hmm. And if so, who and how did they support her?
So I think it's fair to say she did not have mentors. Mm-hmm. The closest thing to a mentor she had was Hugh Downs. And it wasn't that he was a great mentor, it's just that he wasn't so hostile, And when he left the Today Show, he encouraged the Today Show to consider her as a co-anchor, which they did not. So he was helpful, but in terms of someone who she'd go to for advice, how should I handle this, the kinds of things that you might rely on a mentor to do, I don't think there was that figure in her life. And maybe that made her less likely to be a mentor because she had not had the experience and the benefits of having a mentor. So thank God for mentors.
Thank you, Susan. And she has a hard stop at 11, so if you want to buy a book,
I'll sign it.
Sign it.
Yep, I'd be delighted. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Jean.
Yeah. Do you have a pen?
I do have a pen. I brought my lucky
Start
pen.
with mine.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.